citizenship, civility through self-liability. Here's the outline. I'll first talk about civility, the legality and the morality of being a citizen. But then, since we live in a society together, we want a some sort of neutrality that's that John Rawls tried to explore, a liberal neutrality by identifying what it is for something to belong to some comprehensive doctrine. But I will approach the problem differently through self-liability, which I hope is has its own neutrality. And of course, I'll talk about liability, what it is, and in contrast to responsibility. And lastly, solidarity, what makes a group society through mutual respect, and how it empowers cooperation among members of a society. So civility, because we live in a society, we especially with a constitutionalism, we a city or a country even is built on a constitution, and citizens are conferred power through that through the written constitution, which constitutes the common knowledge of what the constitution is. And so citizen in broadly construed liberal society, they have their civil rights, and the basic ones like the right to vote, for example, is something that's that citizens ought to have. And given that right, there is a corresponding power that's been legally conferred so that citizens can enforce their right through having been such empowered. And of course, one way one's civil right is enforced is through having the power to vote, to have a vote for various people in the public sector. And to use public office as an example, that's when one is empowered to enforce certain right, and in virtue of being entitled legally to do a certain thing, one has that legal right. And the interaction between the legality and morality of right and duty and power, which is conferred by members of a society through the constitution. These things are what's at the background of the discussion about citizenship and in the end liability. So morality, of course. So if we go on with the public office example, the someone that's been thus legally empowered, there rule that the person, the official, has to follow. And well, there's a difference between failing to do the best and violating the rule, doing the wrong thing. And power abuse, that's one way in which one not only failed to live up to one's standard to act competently, but one would be exercising one's power wrong. And to talk about duty, the discharge of duty, because when someone occupied a certain position, a certain office with this corresponding legally conferred power, that person is supposed to discharge certain duty, and it's in virtue of discharging those duty that the corresponding right is substantiated, because if you were not to discharge those duty, then the right that you are supposed to have are without any justification. There's nothing that substantiates the corresponding right, and thus the power that's been legally conferred, it's not justified by the corresponding right. And that's a road ethics, because we talk about the road of someone having a certain power, in virtue of which someone is capable and in the impossible to do a certain thing that is not otherwise able. The person would not have been able to do those things, and in order for someone to be permitted to have the permissibility, that's only if the person complied with, let's say, certain rule that that the role is stipulated to follow, and but then it's because given the liberal society that we live in, when we talk about morality in society, that there's the issue, the worry that it clashes with among members of society. So, and I want to explore what kind of neutrality that we want in such a society. So, because then when we talk about differences among members of society, then we can try to look at that through the lens of relativity. And one way we can observe such a relativity is for people belonging to different religion, and especially for people with different religion, there are different things that are sacred. So Christians, and Catholics, the Holy Sacrament, and prayers and baptism, and maybe for Muslim, those that belong to the Islam, they pray at towards the direction of Mecca. So these things, religion, various religions, they believe in certain things, certain practices to be sacred, and on a religious exclusivism, because the doctrines are inconsistent. For example, Christianity, which entails that Jesus is Christ and divine, while Islamicism entails that otherwise, that Jesus is only a prophet without being himself divine. So these two religions are incompatible. But relative to each religion, there are different things that are sacred. And if we were not to question the reality of the sacred, then we can see the religion having that relativity, because relative to different practitioners, there are different things that are sacred, and they have their own practices. And of course, to think about culture as there are differences in norms. The norms need not presuppose something let's say supernatural, because when we talk about the sacred, it's usually something that's typically described as supernatural, but for different culture and different norm, and even if, let's say, a Chinese eat with chopsticks and Westerners knives and forks, that's also different norms. And it's in virtue of belonging to a certain culture, or maybe when you want to experience a culture, that those norms matter, but they are relative to various culture, various religion. And one thing that's underdetermined by morality, I think, is convention. It's like driving on the left or the right. Well, once the people in the city agreed to a certain convention, then there is indeed a fact of the matter, whether it's right to drive on one side or the other. But that correctness is dependent on a certain construction. The construction is through agreement, setting up convention, that the right and wrong, or at least the correctness or appropriateness, depends on social, mutual, the constitution of, through the agreement of members of the group. And that's how we could have a pluralism that's a cultural pluralism, let's say, because in different culture there are different conventions. But again, there are conventions that some are born into without having prior agreement, and that's another thing. But at least I would try to understand the relativity using convention and construction dependence, especially when these conventions do make a difference to experience, lived experience. So, but then even given this relativity at the background, that some values are relative and specific to certain culture, and it's a pluralism that I hope have humanity underlying all cultures. There are something that's universal, and I think it's choice, because human beings, we have free will, and we make our choices. Of course, there are people that are born into a certain culture, but in a liberal society, we permit self-identification with a certain culture. Of course, even with gender, it's not supposed to be determined only by biology. Someone born male is permitted to identify as a woman, but of course, this identification of culture, what underlies everything is choice, and that's a universality among all these different culture with different values. And on the other hand, there's also the objectivity of what it is when someone act with goodwill and someone has a goodwill and someone is not ill wishing, and whether someone meant well. That's beyond the universality that underlies all culture. There's also the objectivity of what it is to for what goodwill is, because humanity obligates respect, and it depends on the normativity of goodwill, of that we can make choices, and we are to be treated as end in itself. And given all this at the background, we can understand why convention and the construction dependence is through mutual agreement, is through agreement, and agreement requires common knowledge that both parties or everyone in every member of the society knows what is being agreed to, and through mutual respect, that the agreement is made, not especially not being coerced on other members of the society. So that's, I think, what underlies, or at least should underlies, the plurality of value in different culture, humanity. And so to bring us something from humanity, that's liability, that's maybe it has certain existentialist flavor, but I will stick with a slightly earlier philosopher like Immanuel Kant, when he talks about autonomy, that's or self-determination. Of course, when he talks about self-determination, he talks about self-legislation. in virtue of acting only on maxims that are universalizable, but we don't always reason in such an elaborate way, but at least at a certain time when we want to do a certain thing, it's rational only if what one wanted is what one wanted that one wanted. If it's a want that you don't want, then it borders on or even is a blatant irrationality. But sometimes, like people with addiction, they do that, and it questions their autonomy, whether they are self-determining or whether they, like brain trauma patient with a prefrontal cortex aneurysm, they might, or maybe even a lesion, they might, when they see food nearby, they will grab them without any self-control, and that again questions the autonomy of the putative agent. And self-determination, the one important thing in a liberal society is lifestyle, way of life, how we are to live, and that, of course, how our life goals are, what we want to achieve in our life, it determines our value. Because let's say if we want to be a philosopher, then, well, reading philosophy books are of a higher value to us than otherwise. And there are people who values similar things less. Of course, there are objective value to certain things, and if knowledge and wisdom, they are valuable to everyone the same, then that's the kind of value that's common to everyone. But then there are values that depend on differences in lifestyle. So self-determination and differences in value because of differences in lifestyle, that's of one's own choosing. And of course, dignity, if dignity obligates, that obligation entails possibility, because whether must implies can. Maybe there are times at which we are obligated to do a certain thing, but we can't do that. And because of we're living in a society without a corresponding freedom, because we're limited, because they're constrained in society. But dignity obligates that the society be improved such that what we must do, we can. And including if we were to self-determine for our future, what we are to do, given that's a rational want, a rational decision that we set as our life goal, and that obligates our what we are to do. Sometimes we want to do, and on the rationality of the want, we must do a certain thing, but we can't. And that's when improvement in society comes in, when we talk about liberty later on. And if we focus on self-determination, autonomy, then of course we have to focus also on responsibility, like what Immanuel Kant again has said in what is enlightenment, that we take a responsibility for ourselves and think for ourselves instead of appealing only to authority, and be accountable to what we do and think. But at least when we think about responsibility, we think about the consequences. Let's say some body cells are cancerous, and it will be responsible for the earlier death of someone. That's the consequence, and it's only instrumental that those cells be removed if given the irreversibility of such bodily tissues, the cancer's irreversibility. So, but we wouldn't blame the cancer cell. We just want to get well and remove the cause. What's responsible for our worsening health? But on a meritocracy, we talk about worth. We talk about whether a certain action is praiseworthy or blameworthy. It's not only about the consequences. We also talk about a person that does this. And of course, when sometimes there are things that are, let's say, in the way, and it blocked a certain improvement in society, but the person might not know it. So he doesn't know that he must have walked away, but that's one thing. But when he knows that he must, the knowledge aspect of obligation and the non-compliance of the failure to discharge certain duty, whether one knows it or not, I think it makes a difference to whether it's merely instrumental that certain action is to be stopped, or whether to be retributively punished, and of course, on the other hand, to be rewarded through distributive justice, because we reward someone for the contribution not only because of the better consequences of society, but because they deserve those rewards, and that's meritocracy, that's worth. And to think about responsibility by distinguishing whether someone knows it or not. We can also think about because to take control of oneself, to own what one does, personhood. There's a special case about owning up to what one does, including owning up to what one is, because through development, of course, there are factors that make a difference to how we develop and our personality. But then it is each of us, our integrity, that we not only do we own up to what we do and the consequences of our action, and we also own up to what we are. And I think that's very important in a liberal society, because especially when there's a freedom that we are not limited in a certain way, such as we have a right to privacy when we vote. And if we were to vote irresponsibly, because we're not accountable to anyone else but ourselves. And of course, we will suffer if the result of the vote is bad. But someone, a person, a legal person, even a unit of responsibility legally, they will own up to the consequences of their action. And that makes a very big difference to whether someone has the corresponding civility to trust the system, and whether they deserve the civil right and the corresponding power to exercise those rights. So that's roughly the idea. But then to bring it all back to society, the big picture, and in relation to moral education, solidarity, because there's a difference between a collectivity that's married together, but they might have some coordinated behaviors, but there are times when cooperation breaks down, and if a group is identified with common goal, and of course there are groups that members of which without common knowledge about the identity of the group members, but at least if a group is identified as agent with a common goal, then what makes a group, when it is that a group constituted a society, it may, whether members cooperate sustainably over time, makes a difference to whether that group constitutes a society. And a game theoretic understanding of society, cooperation, because game theory, it extends decision theory, which roughly put is a study of decision under uncertainty, and game theoretic approach is to understand behavior, decision under uncertainty of others' decision. So some more uncertainty, and that depends on others' probability function and utility function. And if we are to, through respect, cooperate through mutual respect, because that's what constitutes solidarity. That's a collectivity. That's when people get together with a kind of sociality that we have the fellow feelings, because through mutual respect, we feel for others, we sympathize and we empathize when others are happy or when others are sad. And that is a collectivity that goes beyond a mere coordination of a smooth running of the group. And with that in mind, I want to look at the individual. So for at least for human being, an agent, that's someone with free will, but not everyone with free will is a person, I think, because there are times in which they fail to own up to what they are, and they don't have the self-respect that they ought to have, because human beings are supposed to perfect their goodwill, and through in virtue of not being someone that fully, well, at least not acting on respect for oneself, one would be exercising one's free will in a way that's immoral. And a decision theoretic understanding of a person at an individual level, because decision theory, it uses probability function and utility function to understand decision. And in a society, it's individual liberty, the freedom to do the right thing, the thing that one rationally wanted to do, that makes a difference to how one behave, the pattern of behavior over time in response to environment. And in a liberal society, if someone were not self-liable, if someone does not respect oneself in a way that owns up to what one is and be liable to what one has become, then all this breaks down, and it just doesn't go through the whole society. It's not a society at all, and it fails to sustain the cooperation, the mere coordination of behavior at a group level will break down. So, given all this at the background, and I think that what citizenship is constituted by, what we need, and what citizenship entails, and the power that with which we can exercise our civil right. But then among different citizens, there are differences in value, but we want a neutrality that that helps us understand how different citizens are to live together. And one among every different culture, I think one thing is constant, which is liability to oneself, what one is, to own up to one's own being, and of course also one's behavior at a certain time, to own up to one's the consequences of one's action. Because without that, without the civility of being responsible for what one does and what one is, the putative society that through which citizens are legally conferred a corresponding power to make choices. Because if the citizens were not to hold themselves liable, then even in a pragmatist, Deweyan way, the citizens, even through voting, democracy, participation, they will not learn from their mistakes. So that's a very sad outcome. Thank you very much.